you'll have billions, but if I could hear a rough idea of how each of you thinks project should be defined moving forward.
Who'd like to go first? Vicky, you partly answered the question, no?
I mean, I think in my opening remarks I did touch on that question a bit. I suppose for the least confusion, for us, projects is best defined as country and defined from the point of view of the recipients who are receiving the money, on the grounds that this is fundamentally about an accountability proposal, and so one should be looking at where the money has gone. We feel the pain of those who sat there in the NGO community and tried to come up with different definitions, lease, permit, etc., etc. And we've looked at the same thing, but we just don't think it works. I mean, if you take a mining operation, there may be a lease for a port, there may be 2 or 3 mines which have grown over time. So you end up not with one business, but multiple leases and permits. To take a lease as a definition just doesn't work for us. As I alluded, there is a difference, I think, between companies, between sectors, the way they use these words. So our preference is to do on the basis of country. And as I was saying in the pictures, in the numbers, by and large, you can attribute, particularly in developing countries, by and large, we only have one operating mine site or smelter. You can see a country is, in fact, that operation. And I know that the fundamental driver for this, and having been in Burma, I know where it's sort of come from before, is local communities want to know what's the operation in their backyard paying into the capital. We support that, and I think you can get it from country-based figures.
Look, I have by far not enough juridical knowledge to really express an opinion of my own. I know that Publish What You Pay have argued that there should be some legal concept included in the definition of what a project is, like some legal agreement. From arguing from the point of view of the original purpose of really creating transparency, I find that at the definition of the project, which ends up defining the country as the project, is sort of failing the basic test, because the numbers that you will publish will be so highly aggregated that it will be basically no real information about any specific sort of economic relationship, and the usefulness of the information will not be there. So I think a legal definition that ends up being that vague with regard to what a project is supposed to be would not be acceptable.
Can I just come back on that one briefly, Simon? I don't think that actually the numbers will be aggregated, and I'd like to add in one thing which I'm not sure whether Claire mentioned in her introduction. This proposal, as does Dodd-Frank 1504, also requires disclosure of payments to different levels of government, national, subnational, and so on. And I think that's a really important step forward. You don't get that in EITI. You may find, despite asking for those figures, that actually fundamentally most of the money is going into the capital, with the exception of some of your federal states, Western Australia, that kind of thing. You generally don't get very significant payments being made at the local level. But there is already, in the Commission's proposal, before we get into problems of what a project is, there is that disaggregation by levels of government, which I think is important.
Simon, do you want to come back? And otherwise I'll go to Claire if Claire'd like to respond.
The only thing I was going to add to that is it's clear that there's a real difference between oil and oil and gas and mining. And there's also an issue of materiality. I think, look, none of us are interested in, £500 here or there, because, obviously you can have millions of those and that adds up to something. But, we're talking about large amounts of money. So I think what I would say to that question at the moment is that there is a sort of ongoing discussion between different parts of the civil society movement and different companies to try to understand some kind of, I think we'd like to go forward together, basically, try and work out what's an acceptable, manageable amount. So there's been various discussions about, what would count as material. You know, are we talking 10 grand or are we talking $1 million? You know, we don't want the local sort of lunch fees, do we? We want the things that are you know, the real meat. But I think it should be down to conceptually what I have in my head, a project as opposed to a country, because there are often issues around the functionality of the arrangements of the contracts which you know, involve all sorts of weird partners that sort of represent very strange people, and that's where a lot of corruption is now going on. So to have a light shed on money flows associated with a project which sheds light on the players in that format would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, just to say that the two things would work together, in terms of the project and the materiality, yeah? And we've looked at the materiality from the perspective of the governance, of the government. But Vicky, I'm not quite sure how we're going to let the governments decide what the projects are. I mean, how's that going to work in practice?
Sorry, no, I wasn't proposing that. What I was saying is two things. First, the Commission proposal says that payments should be reported by level of government.
Yes,
so national, subnational, etc. And the second was I was saying that when it comes down to definitions, the only thing that we, certainly within the industry, can agree on is we can agree on how to define a country. So if you're looking for a cross, and even there are some issues, particularly if you go and look in Gaza and so on.
Failing state?
Well, I think failing states are countries, but there are some countries where some geopolitical issues at play. Fortunately, not ones that Rio Tinto are in. And I've lost my train of thought.
But how is the government going to have a view on the project then? Okay, so, I mean, you're saying your first point is, yes, but we should focus on the country, not on the project. Okay, fine. But, I mean, Reinhard says, no, sorry, that doesn't get us far enough. We have to go further than that, because otherwise, yeah. But then your answer was, yes, but at the end of the day, it's for the government to define what a project is in terms of...
I wasn't saying it's for the government to define. I was saying that the easiest definitional level is to take the country's borders and the subnational government and so on and so forth. In other words, to report by the recipient who's receiving the money. So the national government receives from Rio Tinto X million, the subnational government receives Y million. Yeah. That's the easiest thing for our accountants to pull the figures out of the mix, because if you take some of our mines, they have grown up as, you know, projects, if you want to call them that, over the years, but they are one operation. They exist as an integrated whole.
You just said that would be the easiest way of doing it.
Yeah, but it's not really what we're after.
I wonder whether we could at all fulfill the goal of the whole operation if we are content with just doing the easiest thing.
Well, I think that's an important point because that's where we need to continue this dialogue with Global Witness and others. What is the goal here? Yeah. My understanding of the goal is that local communities sitting out in the boondocks want to know how much their mine is contributing to the national and subnational coffers. So can we get at that at other ways than sort of trying to define new accounting, basically? I don't think that the goal here is to get companies to produce their accounts in an entirely different way that doesn't have any meaning for the operation.
But I think, I repeat, I think there's a fundamental difference between what you experience and oil and gas. And, for example, you mentioned Grasberg, for example, but we would be interested to know what your partners are doing, having... And
you will be with Dodd-Frank when they have
investigated their activities in that very mine and so on. So, you know, is the project the mine, or is it the project of which you have X% and they have another, or how does that work? You know, I think there's obviously going to be a difference between the mining side versus the oil and gas side. But certainly on the oil and gas side, if we're just going to have a figure for a country, I don't think that really helps. I think we want to get down to figures around, you know, in this block, this much was earned. And I think those are issues also of, you know, risk management concern for investors actually as well. They certainly said so. So I can't speak for investors, but that's certainly the line they have taken in various public hearings on the issue. So I think there's a balance, obviously, between the materiality aspect and the ridiculous.
More questions from the floor.
Thank you. My name is Elsie Boonstra. I work at BBO and I'm here to represent IKV Pax Christi, a Dutch NGO working with local communities, mining communities, mainly on security and human rights issues. My question is about independent auditing, actually. I was wondering what the panelists' stance would be on independent auditing, and especially on the role that NGOs might have in independent auditing. As to me, it would be a big disappointment if companies concerned and governments concerned would simply hire a consultant to confirm a company's compliance with its own reporting standards, and there would be no way to independently verify if the information disclosed is actually accurate. So thanks for your views on this.
Is that a question for you, Simon? Sounds like.
I'm fully in favour of independent auditing. We've had some experience around, since we're talking about the Commission side of things as well, bringing in forestry issues. We've had quite a lot of experience actually of independent monitoring of various forestry reform processes. And we can certainly testify to the difficulty of that. We've had to close down one office, get someone political asylum in your country, and our other project came to an end because there was a general dislike of the fact that part of our monitoring involved naming the people who were doing various criminal activities. Now, okay, that's about illegality versus legality. But following money flows is not that easy. So, I think one has to think very carefully about what kind of independent auditing oversight one creates as to whether you're actually arriving at the answer you want. We have an independent verification process within the EITI at the moment, and our experience in that would suggest that there is a need to keep one's sort of fingers on the pulse a little bit. To make sure that the audit process that is conducted is really what it sets out to be. And certainly along the forest side, we've found that where we've been replaced by companies that put themselves up to doing this kind of work, and they've accepted terms of reference that did not oblige them to publish anything, or in one case even to go in the forest at all. So how that constituted oversight and so on. I think all of these things need to be very carefully worked out beforehand, otherwise you might think you're doing an independent auditing oversight and in fact not do anything at all. But in principle, I'm in favour of it.
And Claire, is this something that the Commission's already addressed in drafting the proposal?
We looked at it. I mean, first of all, I think I should say, in terms of independent audit, the way you talk about it, I mean, of course, you would be in favour, in the sense that it introduces some element of objectivity, let's say, yeah? The problem, I think, I would very much share Simon's views about that, which is how do you get added value in that audit? I mean, who's going to carry it out? I mean, I can imagine who is going to rush to do this job and who is going to be rubbing their hands about doing it, but will they actually bring any added value? I mean, that's the real question. I mean, we looked at this because we had to as part of the impact assessment. And the conclusion was that the accounts have to be audited anyway under a statutory audit. So these payments should be part of that audited account set. So we didn't say anything in addition to that at this stage because of the problems about actually getting something that will have added value.
Can I have one other thing? I don't know what the arrangement would be in Europe, but for example, if you lie on your SEC disclosures, it's not a funny outcome. So I guess one sort of aspect of this which might actually, and I'm not saying this because I think inherently all companies are dishonest at all. I'm saying this really because I think there are some companies that are dishonest, and there are also some companies that behave impeccably here and appallingly there. So it really depends on the company, the circumstance, the period of time. We've come across companies doing really dreadful things and then they're absolutely brilliant somewhere else, at least around the issue we're talking about. So nothing is really kind of black and white in this issue. So I guess my point really is that where you have a mandatory disclosure to a body like the SEC, and I presume an equivalent here, should company X be caught out as not filing the right data for whatever reason, there may be consequences. And so that might be another element to think of in the context of whether or not the figures are reliable.
And just on a point of information to make the analogy with the SEC, who would the accounting information be reported to, and what would be done with that?
I mean, the accounts have to show a true and fair view, so that's the test that has to be fulfilled. And essentially, we have a network of those who are responsible for doing the regulation, but this essentially would be for the member states' authorities to carry out, whether it's the securities regulator or whether it's the relevant regulator that's in charge of the accounting or audit company in terms of what they're doing. So this is not something that we would have. I mean, unfortunately, the Commission's not the SEC, I have to say. We don't have the same resources, for one thing. But no, that would be then something that has to be carried out at national level.
Can I say something on this point on independent audit? I think there are two separate issues which have been somewhat touched on. Audit is a fairly technical skill. As far as I understand, what you're talking about is much more the accountability process and how do we ensure that that's effective in country. And there I think it requires capacity building for two lots of people. One is your tax authorities, who actually need to be able to think, yeah, this looks sensible or not. But also your local civil society. And that's where we would like to see European Commission, other donors building up their ability in that area to support capacity building. And you've already seen, I think, the Australians, the Canadians recently have announced mining sector programs to do that. So that for us is very important, not least because we don't think we're going to get caught out, and we're more than happy for other people to get caught out if they're not filing the right figures and if they're the sort of people that sort of companies Simon's talking about.
Yeah, Reinhard, you wanted to come in and then take some more questions.
Following in the same vein, generally, as Simon, I'm not sure that a routinely organized auditing process would really help solving the problem. I think that we might be more well off if we would sort of think of mechanisms that would allow NGOs to be triggering some revision process under certain conditions. I don't know what they would be, but if companies would be under the threat that if they, well, whatever that means, misbehave in a certain way, they could be called out and sort of challenged, not only just in the public, but sort of by financial oversight authorities, because NGOs would intervene. I think that might be more powerful leverage than just sort of giving a new field of revenue to the consultancy business globally.
Okay, we had a few more questions here.